to save ourselves from what we have done, we must reach far, far back in time. The universe is not at all what we suppose it to be. And that we are in effect presented with a three-dimensional, four-dimensional, 11-dimensional koan, a labyrinth, a puzzle, a kind of conundrum which has to be cut through. And it's all done in the mind. The whole apparent world in the mind. A world in the mind. In the mind is actually syntactical in nature, in the mind. This is what they don't tell you in the philosophy departments or the physics departments, that the universe is made of words, and that there has to be a speaker and there has to be a hearer. Photons, quarks, anti-newmain, that's not what it's about. That is a linguistic model to save ourselves from what we have done, that floats above the bedrock of syntactical connectedness. A world in the mind. The universe is not at all what we suppose it to be. We must reach far, far back in time. A world in the mind. That mind travels through to create networks that it interprets meaningfully. That's what's really going on. The universe is not at all what we suppose it to be. In the mind. In the mind. In the mind. In the mind. And I am not one to reach for, the metaphors of spirit with the connotation of moral opprobrium and all that. But there is a dimension which is accessible to each and every one of us. This is the primary thing about it. It's accessible. A world in the mind. The universe is not at all what we suppose it to be. That is so appallingly, titanically, and bizarrely different than the continuum that we're currently residing in, that it seems to throw doubt on the entire effort to understand the world as it's been carried out over the past 1,500 years. In other words, there is an object in this mental space which, as culture-creating creatures, we are attempting to colonize and invade this cultural space through the concrescence of language. Language. Language In other words, through exteriorizing our ideas as tools, we are invading this cultural domain, this language, alternative reality, and the exploration by drugs with psychedelic drugs, and then the pervasive problem with other sorts of drugs in the society. And it cuts very close to the core of ourselves as creatures. I mean, we are addictive animals. We addict to everything. We addict to each other and glorify it as our most noble outpouring of sentiment in the phenomenon of romantic love. I mean, when a pair of lovers are parted, the withdrawal symptoms are indistinguishable from heroin. I mean, vomiting, shaking, uncontrollable emotional outbursts, sleeplessness, short-tempered, hysteria. This is real. It is what romantic love is a pheromonal psychedelic drug. Psychedelic drug. Bonding, an exchange of chemical messengers which takes these two autonomous organisms and welds them into one galaxy of need and intention and understanding and expectation. But when you just tear that apart, people are shook up. We addict to political ideals, all kinds. I mean, it's wonderful what's happening. Psychedelic drugs. Several decades ago, the same thing was happening in Berlin to a different beat. People find an idea and it works, and all barriers appear to be movable and all goals attainable. Addict to things. This is like magpies, but then through media trained to propel ourselves into ever more extensive relationships with objects. We invent money, which is kind of a multi-transformable drug. It stands for everything, everything you ever wanted, and you can addict to money. What I will argue during this month is that that this is not a bad thing. Psychedelic drugs. Psychedelic drugs. That we have a secret history that I will try to convince you of, and you should try to convince me that I'm wrong. And we will argue over the secret history of the human race and why it is, therefore, that we are as we are. Psychedelic drugs. And why it is that these psychedelics are not some peripheral issue of screwballs who can see God in a cabbage, but that, in fact, the issue of psychedelic drugs, is directly on the tracks of the onrushing locomotive of rationalist, paternalist, schlockoless society. And that it ain't gonna go away, because what we're talking about here is a nude part of the human mind. Psychedelic drugs. What we're talking about here is something which takes its place in the great unfolding of the defining of human freedom that characterizes the entire adventure of global civilization. We've got the Pope under control. That happened in the Middle Ages. Slavery has now been generally embraced as a bad thing to be into. And we've gotten that on the books as a bad idea. Women have been suddenly recognized to be human beings. And so forth. So this swelling bubble of aha and perception of the real nature of the universe should also include the sudden realization that governments have no business telling people what foods and spices they should prefer. That this is an absurd role for government. And that, like slavery, like the subjugation of women, the legal persecution of dietary habits has just got to take its place with the high-button shoes. perhaps believes itself, although I doubt it, is that we would return to the beast. That's all. You know, we would just shoot junk and toot blow and flop around in ruinous orgies until hell froze over. And they, wiser, sterner, more disciplined than ourselves, represent the edifice of moral authority. This is a I'm doing it for your own good trip.